of American politics and the broader picture of totalitarian movements around the world, or rather emotional uprisings, whereby certain people get tricked into feeling special and valued and having moral clarity that is based on something false and something that fevers people's imagination. So in the case of white militia groups, it's the fevered imaginings that there is some inherent superiority to whiteness and that there's some kind of race war that needs to be held in order to restore American greatness, or that's the path to future American greatness. Instead of, what people normally try to aim for, which is towards a more perfect union, the promise of the Constitution that has become reimagined and increased and become more inclusive over time as people have said, how about we also include in that perfect union idea the rights of people who were brought to this country as slaves, and the rights of women to vote and participate. And okay, you know what? We started giving Black people the vote in Reconstruction and then compromised and went backwards on that. Let's have civil rights and restore the right to vote and the right to live freely without having to live in segregated areas in order to enforce this fabricated doctrine of superiority, because it's uncomfortable to challenge that, or it's too awkward a thing to do to rock the boat. White supremacy is a boat that can stand with some rocking. And I saw today there's going to be a program from Philadelphia called A More Perfect Union, which I think is fantastic because it's great to light up the imaginations of people in a peaceful way, to say that's actually our goal. Sometimes at various points in history, the nihilists, the fascists, have become more vocal and more passionate, and they say, we're the patriots, listen to us. Get carried away with our movement that means subsuming your own interests into something bigger than yourself, and without regard for your personal safety, joining an insurrectionist crowd and seeking to overthrow the Capitol to uphold the glorious leader who has promised all of us a glorious future. That type of thinking can be very contagious. And even though Trump has been defeated and he no longer exerts a corrupt influence over the Department of Justice, Craig is pointing out that I'm late. It's true, Craig. I had to stay offline for a bit because I had a grocery delivery come. So rather than start broadcasting and get interrupted, I thought it best to just, my apologies. I'm sorry I'm late. Kim says hello as well. And Sheldon's here and says, in order to effect a change in the fascist Republicans, we must proceed with prosecution, convicting, and jailing of Trump. The head of the snake must be cut off to kill the beast. Yes. I'm a little unsettled sometimes by relatively violent imagery and metaphors, but at the same time, I completely understand where you're coming from. It's lots of Greek mythology allegories there to, I don't know, kill the many heads of the Hydra. Actually, it's just normal zoology, isn't it? If you want to kill a snake, you have to cut off its head. You can kill a snake by just cutting it in two, probably anywhere on its body. But yes, violence becomes very intoxicating when you have a groundswell of fascism happening, and people who have just been a little triggered by language that says Congress doesn't accomplish anything, or our government is broken, nothing's ever achieved. That overgeneralizing swill that denigrates government generally and has always helped shield Republicans from accountability. So when Republicans obstruct and Democrats try to enact pro-social policies to help people and thereby invigorate the economy and American society, they're held back by lack of popular support because of the pervasiveness and the uptake of this poisonous idea that it's just Congress in general. That lack of specificity has led to lack of ability to point to the people responsible for lack of progress on issues where there is a democratic majority of people in favor of certain developments. A majority of Americans are in favor of greater safety for themselves and their families and their communities through the enactment of stronger gun safety laws, stronger background checks, more regular enforced background checks. It's also majority popular for billionaires to be made more accountable to the American people, to have a less encumbered existence where they can evade paying taxes. And the most profitable corporations are best able to pay for accountants who can take advantage of Republican tax breaks and completely maneuver their way out of paying any tax at all. And Joe Biden is foregrounding that issue and drawing attention to it, and the travesty of such a significant gap between relatively less well-off people having no option but to pay substantial amounts of tax, whilst the people best positioned to contribute to society and to pay back the society that sustained and created opportunities for them to flourish, they've been able to get away with paying nothing, as if to say their very existence is a charity for the rest of the United States. They shouldn't have to contribute back to federal coffers, back to government coffers like the plebs that they employ. Sheldon notes that justice can be slow. Yes, justice can be and is slow. Craig forgives me and says, that's fine. Good to see you. Thank you, Craig. I am sorry. And as always, we have our visas to go to the States and we hope to be going there soon. We're trying to get vaccinated before we come. I know in Boston, Massachusetts, you can get vaccinated the same day. I mean, the Biden administration has been so successful with the rollout of vaccines that any adult now, anybody over the age of 16 can make an appointment to get a vaccination. Now the issue is becoming more of a demand issue, is in how can we motivate the holdouts, the vaccine hesitant people who have been poisoned against the idea of taking the virus seriously and taking steps to mitigate community spread, as well as steps to protect themselves. So I think maybe there should be more documentaries detailing the stories of people who are denying COVID. Maybe they would give permission to a documentarian to follow them. They're like, yes, you can follow me, expose that story. They say I've got COVID, but I clearly don't. And then, although then maybe their families would withdraw permission once it became obvious that they did have COVID. I just want it to be more of a prominent factor that people are aware that what's happening in Brazil and what's happening in India is what would be happening in the US had Trump managed to overturn the election results and somehow secure for himself a second term. And when I say somehow, we know a lot more about the mechanism through which he hoped to steal the election now. Look, we know Louis DeJoy instigated the destruction of multiple mail sorting machines in order to slow the mail, and that Trump was aware that his voters, he had sought to deter his supporters from voting by mail. So he knew it would be predominantly Biden supporters voting by mail, and that he sabotaged the passage of that mail, and also said you shouldn't count votes after the first day, i.e. mail-in votes. They're going to be counted later. They shouldn't be counted at all. That was Trump's strategy before the election. And after the election, his strategy was the insurrection, to use rhetoric, heated, intemperate language to incite his most ardent followers to congregate at the Capitol en masse and break through the barriers and overturn the counting of the Electoral College votes after they'd been certified by states on the 6th of January, and for then there to be a delay in which votes would be put back to the states, and Trump would then be able to hope that fruit was born off the pressure he was putting on election officials in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan. He only needed a few states to overturn the actual results of the election. Brian's here and says hello. Hello, Brian. Hello, Knowledge. Sheldon notes that, was it Janet Yellen who said so, the head of the Federal Reserve, that it's reported that the tax evasion of the 1%, the 1% of top earners, exceeds the taxes collected by the rest of taxpayers. Hard to believe. But when you consider the extent of the wealth of the people in the top 1%, then you can perhaps more readily conceive of that all the taxes evaded by the top 1% exceeds the taxes collected from the smaller wages of the people in lower and middle income classes. I think they said it was $7 trillion over the space of 10 years that should have been collected but wasn't, because of the lack of IRS investigation and prosecution from the Internal Revenue Service of the uber wealthy. They cannot be bothered. It takes a lot of resources to investigate and challenge the accountant maneuvers of the uber wealthy and the tax havens and the tax shields, and that takes a lot of energy, and the IRS presumably prefers to chase after the low-hanging fruit of middle class and lower class wage earners, because that takes less resources to get an outcome and to appear productive. Biden has just initiated the release of the patents on the current COVID vaccines in order to allow the rest of the world to manufacture the vaccines for their citizens. My husband notes that it's quite difficult to manufacture vaccines and easy to stuff up. And we saw that millions of doses of the J&J vaccine were ruined when people added the wrong amount of ingredients or something. So he's not actually that excited about actually, I haven't mentioned to him that the patents are being revoked, but before, when I was suggesting to him, is that a good idea, do you think? And he was saying, it's going to be harder for people to manufacture vaccines in a safe way. So I think when I talk about it to him, he's probably going to suggest that Americans devote more resources to ramping up the manufacture of vaccines in the United States and to sell those cheaply or donate them to people in developing countries, because COVID, a pandemic, is a problem that highlights our interconnected fates, that if the pandemic is still present and is still ravaging other nations, America is not safe. All of the budget of the Pentagon will not keep out a virus that is contagious. And if the virus has so many hosts in other countries that more and more mutations develop that then nullify the potency of the vaccine in the United States. None of America's wealth will mount an adequate defense if some of that wealth is not used to remedy the problem in other nations around the world. Another thing that COVID does is highlight the paucity of libertarian morality that says less government is better, because COVID, whether people are conscious of it or not, on an unconscious level, it feeds people's understanding of the absolute deadliness of less government, a government that resigns itself to not interceding on the behalf of Americans, a government that doesn't take action to protect its citizens, a government that only cares about military posturing, a government that only cares about lining its own pockets. I'm talking about a government under Trump, but I'm talking about a lot of Republican goals, of feeding the interests of its donors, a lot of bought out government. When people say government is a swamp or government is corrupt, it's been overgeneralized for so long that people haven't been able to accurately note that the Koch brothers have specifically bought a lot of Republican loyalty, and the Koch brothers have significantly obstructed government legislation that would have helped people. It specifically brought Republicans out so that they would oppose environmental protection laws and falsely characterize them as officious bureaucracy instead of life-saving initiatives that could prevent deaths from exposure to carcinogens and neurotoxins, etc. I've got one little account here who is claiming, possibly truthfully, possibly a complete fabrication, claiming to be a Black Democrat for Trump. And the thing is, there exist Black voters who support Trump, and there even exists a tiny proportion of Democrats who support Trump as well. Trump's a weakened character, out of office, kind of more pathetic. His promised social media platform turns out to be like a blog that he has to rectify, in his eyes, the lack of access to social media platforms such as Twitter or Facebook. Facebook, because it's treasonous and cowardly, has refused to permanently block Trump, but they have renewed his temporary block yesterday. Oh, Sheldon's breaking some news. It says, I believe the recount in Arizona by the Trump-leaning affiliated group has determined that Biden was indeed the victor. That'll surprise a lot of people, not because we doubted that Biden was the victor of the 2020 election in Arizona and a multiplicity of other states, but also because we presumed that Trump-affiliated recount group was purely doing a recount in order to fabricate evidence, and all of the signs that they were using blue pens when the ballots themselves are marked in blue pens, that they were leaving out laptops unsecured, that was all an excuse for evidence to be manufactured out of thin air to support the false narrative that Trump was truly the God, Emperor, Victor of the 2020 election. But if there were some people who backed out of that type of criminal behavior, or who didn't want to participate in fabricating election results, then that's a surprising victory, and I'll take it. But yes, so this person, I guess I can just mute them, because look, if you are a real person, and that's always possible, if you're a real person and not just a paid troll account, then why are you for Trump? Is it because they tricked you into thinking that your interests were best served by a Republican Party that misdirected funds for small businesses, that ensured that billions of dollars of taxpayer money went to large corporations instead of going to the Main Street businesses that it was supposed to protect and prevent the dissolution of those businesses and the collapse of small local economies whilst COVID was ravaging American communities. I mean, COVID is still ravaging American communities. There are still people dying, people who aren't vaccinated, and people who are struggling to survive this period where vaccination rates are starting to plateau, and that peak has not been reached yet, that critical mass of vaccinated people that will see a large drop-off in cases across the board. Because at the moment, in certain demographics where there are high vaccination rates, there's been a steep decline in cases and a steep decline in hospitalizations and deaths in those certain age brackets. But yes. Oh yes, they were looking for bamboo fibers in Arizona because of the unsubstantiated, fabricated conspiracy theory that there were ballots imported from China because Trump was trying to capitalize on any latent xenophobia in the hearts and minds of Republican-leaning voters to tell them that, yes, Biden was stealing the election by having people from China send over fraudulent ballots. And they were also apparently looking for mystical markings on ballots with UV lamps. Craig notes that India makes a lot of the generic drugs that the United States takes, so I'm sure they can make vaccines. Yes, but vaccines are the trickiest kind of drugs to make, requiring very consistent conditions and very precision recipe following, I guess. And Sheldon also notes that COVID will exist for years if not eradicated. Bernadette's here and says hello. Hello, Bernadette. Nice to see you. Brian notes that we are seeing younger and younger cases in his intensive care unit where he's a nurse. Young woman several weeks postpartum, now on a ventilator. It's very sad. I'm just going to get rid of this. It's very sad, and Brazil is reporting a lot of pregnant women dying of COVID as well. So pregnancy makes you more vulnerable. Pregnancy puts your various systems under more stress because you're undergoing a chore, a big challenge, a big task. Your body is producing a whole ass human being, and with a different immune system to your own. And there's a lot of factors, there's a lot of vulnerabilities there. So COVID is a concern. They're vaccinating pregnant women more regularly now. And I think one concern that the anti-vax people were trying to hype at one point was a false association they were trying to draw between the vaccine and lower fertility rates, which was, they just made that up out of whole cloth. What really lowers fertility rates is the fact that COVID is affecting men's sperm counts and affecting virility, affecting the ability to sustain an erection for men, because one of the characteristics of COVID is that it's a vascular condition as well as a respiratory condition. So it affects blood flow and contraction levels of arteries and veins. And so if you're having problems with blood circulation, I can see why you'd have trouble pumping enough blood to your genitals to sustain an erection, to be able to procreate or do a whole bunch of other things, which apparently some people find gratifying. Bernadette says, sounds like an ongoing saga of never-ending strife and despair. Why is devastation profitable and humanity isn't? It's a big question, Bernadette. But these are the challenges of our time. Other generations have faced different challenges, but humanity has characteristics, and some of them, like our potent imaginations, can lend themselves to creativity, and it can also lend itself to very imaginative, destructive capabilities. We made up communism, and that's an ideology that has lured a whole bunch of people to participate in really oppressive, violent, murderous governments, as well as fascism, also conscripting a lot of people to participate in very bloody, racist, hateful, xenophobic wars and oppressive. This is not a cheerful topic. I was reading about the Khmer Rouge, though, so some other time when people feel psyched to deal with a little bit of awful history, we'll have an awful history segment where we can talk about what happened with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, because, yes, that was a type of communism as well, where the role of the naturalistic fallacy looms really large. The naturalistic fallacy being an error pattern where you say if it's natural, it must be good. And with the Khmer Rouge, their particular ideology valorized people in rural areas. And those rural people were being poorly served by the Cambodian economy, which was set up so that rural people borrowed money from moneylenders in urban townships, got into lots of debt, and had to deal with oppressive interest rates and things like that. So when that form of Khmer Rouge communism came along, they said the founding base of the Cambodian people is going to be agricultural workers, and we're going to evacuate all the townships, get rid of the moneylenders. And the rural base would have appreciated that because they were made into the heroes of the story. Heroes of the story, that's a nice, simple way to talk about a lot of things that are problematic. Because a lot of people with guns, there's responsible gun owners. I want to distinguish between the two groups. That distinction is really important. Responsible gun owners who support a strengthening of background checks and red flag laws and not having access to guns if you're suicidal or a domestic violence offender, etc. Responsible citizens who own guns, and then irresponsible gun owners who say any legislation is inherently unsatisfactory and oppressive to my God-given rights and my own personal misinterpretation of the Second Amendment, which admittedly has also been backed up to a degree by a Supreme Court judgment in 2008, the Heller judgment that said, yep, it's oppressive to restrict personal gun ownership within certain limits. Like you can't have semi-automatic weapons, you can't have guns near schools or government buildings. He put some limits on it, but that hyper-individualistic hero of my own story gun mythology has led to people saying that the Second Amendment is a God-given right, is in the Bible, and also that the most significant phrase in it is shall not be infringed, conveniently leaving out that the Second Amendment is describing America's early informal army, referred to as a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, a military expression referring to America's informal army, shall not be infringed upon. So I'm always trying to spread the word of that, which is that sensible people, a majority of American people, are sensible and want stronger gun safety laws and want stronger enforcement of the laws that already exist. And they don't want to have to fear mass shootings. They don't want their children to be emotionally terrorized by America's status as being an internationally infamous country because of the reign of terror of out-of-control gun owners, some of whom are legal, most of whom are legal gun owners. They've legally been able to purchase weapons from shops or gun sales, gun shows, and then wreak havoc on their communities by killing people at their workplaces, in their homes, on the streets, in churches, in places of worship, in movie theaters, in malls, everywhere. So that if you're a sensible person, you know that there's a degree of risk involved in merely existing in the United States. That is to say, unless you've buried that knowledge down underneath a big conviction that one day you will get to play the hero in a story and you will be Bruce Willis crawling around the vent of a building to secretly drop down and open fire on a bad guy, you as a good guy. When the truth of the matter is people who own guns that they don't secure properly are far more likely to feature as a bad guy in a story. The bad guy who left out a weapon that their teenager then used to commit suicide in a moment when they were feeling down and hopeless. Or the bad guy who got caught up in a domestic violence dynamic with their partner and shoots their own wife or girlfriend or partner. The bad guy in a situation where, well, I hesitate to call bad guy, but a bad decision to have a gun around, which then acts as an intoxicant to someone who's stuck in a suicide ideation pattern and uses that gun as a highly effective method to take their own life, when the statistical chances of recovery from a suicide attempt are much higher when other methods are used. Gun wounds are much less reversible than drug overdoses or poisonings or even knife wounds. Brian has given me a Super Heart Award. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to bring up Joe Manchin now because I just think this is really important. Mitch McConnell's been very clear to say my focus right now is to stop this administration, i.e. he has no intention as the all-powerful leader of Senate Republicans. At least he's the minority leader right now, but it is thin, and Joe Manchin appears to be allied with the Republicans much of the time rather than Democrats. He's like, his agenda, he put it right clearly on the table. We already knew what his agenda was if we were paying attention, but hopefully that brings more people into an accurate understanding of how the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, conceives of his own role in government. That is to say, he intends to obstruct any legislation put forward by the Democrat Party and by President Joe Biden. So Joe Manchin was confronted by CNN anchor person Chris Cuomo, who said, why is bipartisanship still your goal when Mitch McConnell has been very clear that he has no space available for bipartisanship because his entire agenda is to obstruct the Democrats? That's just ruling out bipartisanship. So let's hear Joe Manchin try to talk his way through that one and hope that more people talk to Joe Manchin, more anchors effectively question Joe Manchin as to how he can try to sustain that position that bipartisanship is desirable, and he's withholding his supportive vote from Democrats, trying to pass measures to secure elections and secure American democracy, and not allow Republican states to say, you know what, we're just going to let Republican officials overrule the results of specific election officials. If we don't like those results, we're going to send our own legislators back to, or our own raft of electors back to Congress in the 2024 elections. Yeah. All right, let's listen to Joe Manchin. It's got 9.7 thousand views, but it needs hundreds of thousands of views, really.
Hey, Joe. Go ahead. Okay, we agree on that. Joe Biden has got more done in 100 days.
But not with them.
Any president in my time that I can recall.
Not with them.
Basically, he got more done. He's put a plan out there, and he got more done.
But not with them.
He got it done, okay? And
but
we're
not
moving
with
in the right
them.
direction.
Not with them.
But you've heard Joe Biden. He wants it to work. It will work.
But they don't want it to work. He just told you, I'm stopping the administration. He just said it to you.
You don't know. You don't.
He just said it.
That was one person.
He's the head.
That's one person.
He's the leader.
He's not controlling all of that. I can assure you, we would not be having the discussions. There wouldn't be an offer on the table of $500 or $600 billion of infrastructure, some starting point, which I think is a good starting point. Let's look at what we've done. We've got to hold ourselves accountable and responsible. Let's make sure that the numbers we're putting out there is really going to.
I have no problem with you guys being fiscally responsible about it. But I would ask you one thing.
Hey, Joe.
Go ahead.
Okay, we agree on that. Joe.
So what did you guys think of that? I should have taken myself off the. Do you want to hear it again? Do you want to hear it again to make some sense of what Joe Manchin's trying to say? What's he trying to say? That, oh, yep, I'm just happy to talk about Joe Biden's accomplishments. Clearly, he doesn't need the filibuster to end because he's done so much. Yeah, he's done so much through budget reconciliation, which allows the Democrats to have a path around the filibuster. And Joe Biden's done so much because they've used that with his big initiatives. And also he has a great team of workhorses with regards to the vaccination rollout. But that's the stuff that he can do. There's more that he can do that he is being obstructed on because Republicans are clinging to that bastion of white rural Christian affirmative action, Koch brother power insurance program, the filibuster. I mean, the Koch brothers didn't invent the filibuster, but by buying enough Republican loyalty, they are able to exert that thumb on the scale of American government in their own favor and against the interests of the American people. So Joe Manchin, who is the senator for West Virginia. It's a purpley red state. And some people have noted that there is often a circle of Joe Manchin behavior in that he postures to say that he won't vote with Democrats, but then ultimately he does. So he creates publicity for himself around that tension of will he help the Democrats achieve anything or will he obstruct it? But then more times than not, apparently, he ends up voting with the Democrats. And Other people, though, are starting to really form this solid impression because of Joe Manchin's behavior with the filibuster, writing an op-ed about how he will never support the end of the filibuster and how he thinks it's important to maintain this tool that essentially is something just used by Republicans to limit the influence and limit the achievements of Democrats in office, in order to better argue that Democrats don't make any difference and you might as well restore Republicans to power because at least they won't hurt your feelings by calling you racist. Yes, Joe Manchin was trying to minimize the role of Mitch McConnell because Chris Cuomo, we'll listen to it again.
Biden has got more done in 100 days.
But not with them.
Any president in my time that I can recall.
Not with them.
Basically, he got more done. He's put a plan out there, and he got more done.
But not with them.
We got it done, okay? And
but
we're
not
moving
with
in the right
them.
direction.
Not with them.
But you've heard Joe Biden. He wants it to work. It will work.
But they don't want it to work. He just told you, I'm stopping the...
All right, I'm struggling with this. Come on, little thing. There we go. Okay. Going back a little bit, Chris Cuomo was being quite clear that Mitch McConnell has just said 100% of my focus is on stopping this administration.
But you've heard Joe Biden. He wants it to work. It will work.
But they don't want it to work. He just told you, I'm stopping the administration. He just said it to you.
You don't know. You don't.
He just said it.
That was one person.
He's the head.
That's one person.
He's the leader.
He's not controlling all of that. I can assure you, we would not be having the discussions. There wouldn't be an offer on the table of $500 or $600 billion of infrastructure. A starting point, which I think is a good starting point. Let's look at what we've done. We've got to hold ourselves accountable and responsible. Let's make sure that the numbers we're putting out there is really going to.
I have no problem with you guys being fiscally responsible about it. But I would ask you one thing.
Okay. So he says, I want to ask you one thing. That's the end of the clip. I don't know what the extra one thing that Cuomo asks Manchin, but Cuomo wipes his brow as Joe Manchin continues to insist that I assure you he's not in charge of all that. He is. Mitch McConnell is a very effective whip of the Republican Party. And that reminds me, I can find something else. Jake Tapper. Right. Okay, so Jake Tapper was talking with a bunch of people on a panel and said that Republicans are lying, that they are very unrepentantly lying. Now, a lot of us know that to be true, but also a lot of people in the media cultivate a reputation for bipartisanship that involves not being clear with the public about the fact that Republicans are lying, of maintaining this falsity that Republicans are good faith players in a two-party system. They're not. They're the anti-democratic party. And I guess their actions with deposing Liz Cheney from her position of authority within the Republican Party as third in command as the House GOP chair, they've made it more clear that they intend to pursue Donald Trump's position of lying to the public about the election and creating a powerful, evocative web of lies around the idea that he won the election and it was stolen, that victory was stolen from him by Joe Biden. Let It Be is here and said, hi, Dav. Hi, Let It Be. I'm going to share this clip of Jake Tapper talking. At some points, I might try and scroll through it. He starts to go into a lot of detail about why he thinks it's necessary to have a functional Republican Party. And he starts saying certain opinions and saying, this is not my opinion. He's just hypothetically adopting the position of a Republican to say, you need somebody to say that proposal is wrong. Let's not spend a lot of money on infrastructure and let's not do this, which is quite interesting to reveal that Jake Tapper thinks it's so always necessary to have a contrarian opposite. I mean, surely bipartisanship means sometimes you might say, well, you know what, I didn't think of that idea, but it's a good idea. Whereas Jake Tapper was very clear, you have to have an opposition so you can have someone to counter every move that Democrats make with an opposite point of view. He could have made it clear that, you know, if they genuinely feel in principle that a policy needs to be opposed, they could do that. Americans are supposed to have a big appetite for bipartisanship, whereby people pursue and unify over policies that are evidently beneficial instead of reflexively adopting a partisan oppositional perspective for each paper, for each policy. Well, that's a good phrase, reflexively oppositional. I started to write a blog for today where I said the phrase of the day would be unsubstantiated conspiracy theories, because a lot of the time we dismiss people for being conspiracy theorists, but that undercuts our ability to draw attention to real active coalitions of conspirators who work against the interests of the American people. It's hard for us to believe in those conspiracies if we're nice people and we project that on the world, but there do exist people who work in bad faith to make money at the expense of other people's peaceful existence. And those who subscribe to QAnon, it's as if they're allergic to that niceness, the falsity of that niceness, that we have to believe that everyone in the world has good intentions. Maybe some of them are just ill or confused or suffer from a bad past. They're like, no, we want to believe in evil. We want to believe in Satan, and so we want to believe in whatever story you tell us about Satan worshippers and how they're entirely concentrated in the Democratic Party, which is nonsense. There's been far more Republicans convicted of sex crimes than there have been Democrats. Some Democrats convicted of sex crimes, and Bill Clinton very publicly proved to be someone who strayed outside of his marital vows in an undignified way with an intern at the White House. But that caused that's a long burn of damage to the Democratic Party. But Republicans have committed a lot more sinister sex trafficking, child sexual assault crimes, presumably because whilst lots of people have the potential to have misdirected sexual impulses, there's a lot more abuse of power associated with the formalized system of the patriarchy, where you say everybody's subject to my manliness. So my children and my wife are beneath me. And then you see consequences from that, which is some Republican politicians being convicted of abusing their own family members. And yeah, I guess Democrats don't make as much political capital off that as it would be the case if it was true of Democrats rather than Republicans. Democrats will be quiet about it because it's distasteful and unpleasant. Republicans would be running with those type of stories for very sustained periods of time, I imagine. Okay, now, this is the Mediaite article that I'm going to scroll down on and play a bit of
为什么愁眉苦脸？
我老公现在可以打疫苗了，
我也是。
还有我，但是我不知道他应不应该去打。你知道啦，
You go
还
to
有糖尿
Singapore
病。
pro-vaccination
不
ad
用
right
担
now.
心，我老公和大伯之前也不太确定要不要打疫苗，不过医生说了可以放心，没问题的，所以他们都已经打了。没事。
等一下，慢性疾病
Wait,
也可以
can
打
those
疫
with
苗
chronic？
那我
conditions
的
get
姐姐有心
vaccinated?
脏病
My sister
也
has
可以
heart
打吗？
disease. Can she
我的
still
医
get the
生说
shot?
可以。
My doctor says
高胆
can.
固醇也没问
What
题。
about those
还
with
有
high
我侄女的
cholesterol?
朋友的
And my
妈
niece's
妈的
friend's
弟弟
mother's
有高
brother
血
has
压，
hypertension.
而且还在吃
And
中
is
药，
also
这
taking
样也可以
TCM.
打
Can
疫
she get
苗
the。shot? Hello?
我也有高血
Yes, I
压
have，hypertension
你看
too,
我
and
打了
it's
之
safe for
后
my
还不是好好的吗？
哎，等一下，我还是有点担
I'm still
心
not。sure.
还等什么？
Why
再
wait?
等我们就
Wait
倒
any longer and
了
we。will fall.
接种疫苗能保护你和你的家人。有以下健康问题的人也适合接种疫苗。
That's so cool because I would love to pay for a collection of pro-vaccination ads
如果你对接种疫苗还有疑虑，请和你的医生谈一谈。
The people who are holdouts against the vaccine have largely been determined to be
现在就上网报名接种
the
冠病疫苗。
Republican-affiliated people who bought into Trump's deceptions
Liz Cheney
about
is taking a stand
Trump's
despite
deceptions.
knowing that.
Hey. Oh, maybe it's the right thing. Trump's deceptions about the vaccine being a Democratic hoax, and a deception from Trump that has been supported and propagated by Fox and OAN and Newsmax. Everybody that has seen personal financial reward in harming the American people in order to advance a pro-Trump narrative that he's just a wonderful person who was taken down by pernicious Democratic hoaxes to say that there was a pandemic, and that all of those deaths are actually not true. All of the people have spent months convincing themselves that Trump was telling them the truth. It's easier to continue to fool someone than convince them that they've been fooled in the first place, even when they come down with COVID themselves. Brian has often told us that they'll be in his ICU unit protesting until their last breath that it's just the flu, it's not COVID. There you go. Bernadette says Manchin is Seroquel, keeping good legislation constipated and continuous withdrawals. That's interesting. Frank is here saying hello from Los Angeles. Hello, Frank. Nice to see you. The phrase of the day is unsubstantiated conspiracy theories, to draw a distinction between some more substantiated conspiracies that point out that there have been various movements, the CNP, the Council of National Policy, that Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon were members of, and that got funding from the Koch brothers, to buy influence with Republican politicians, and thereby cultivate a political party that was ripe for the fascist excesses of Trumpism, the cult of personality that is Trumpism, by celebrating a man who grabs the headlines and feeds into the culture war, while a lot of Republican agendas get enacted on, namely tax cuts for the rich and sabotage of public parks, sabotage of environmental protection standards, sabotage of public health responses to pandemics, sabotage of a lot of things that require public expenditure in order to keep the population more closer to teetering on the edge of financial viability, so that more people fall off the edge, more people become desperate. There's more of a feudal class begging for employment in a Coke industry at unlivable wage levels. Coke like the pop. Okay, Coke like soda. So I'm saying it correctly then when I say the surviving Koch brother. All right, now I wanted to go back to this because I'm about to commend and applaud Jake Tapper for being clear and emphatic in his denunciation of Republican lies. Not as much as I'd like, but it's a start, and baby steps is still something I celebrate when it's in a direction towards a goal that helps people rather than harms them. Sheldon notes that Biden makes his points with a whisper. It's very effective. Oh, good. He has some finely toned political skills. He's also, I think, a very straightforward person whose occasional moments that are sometimes described as gaffes are because he wears his heart on his sleeve. And he is someone who's grown up in a slightly more racist milieu, but he has fought for a long time to be on the side of anti-racist, to be an ally of Black Americans and indeed Black people around the world, because I've seen speeches from him that are decades old, powerful advocacy in favor of opposing apartheid in South Africa. And Joe Biden was the man who pushed for the Violence Against Women Act to help, again, stand up for the underdog, not to liken women to dogs, but to note where there's power discrepancies and more government protections is required. So he believes that governments can act for good, as opposed to Republicans who always argue and appear to buy their own supply, that government is inherently flawed and should be minimized as on principle, and instead, as I said before, COVID highlighted the harm that arises from indulging politicians and electing politicians who believe and who act in a way to minimize government influence, that is actively harmful. All right, trying to find Jake Tapper. Here we go.
This is going to cost her her job. It could cost her everything politically. What does that say to you?
Well, it says to me, first of all, that obviously we seldom see politicians doing things that might actually hurt them politically because they believe it's the right thing. I mean, it's rare in this day and age, and we're seeing Liz Cheney do that right now, which says quite a positive thing about her and the fact that she's willing to stand up for what she believes is right. Now, beyond that is what she's standing up for, and what she's standing up for are basic facts, basic truth. This is not a debate about troop levels in Afghanistan or whether $6 trillion in new spending proposals from Biden is a good idea. She's actually very conservative when it comes to these policy issues. This is about truth and democracy, and the way you framed it earlier. And it's remarkable that standing up for just basic facts is now controversial within the Republican Party. I happen to think that the reason House Republican leader is so frustrated with Liz Cheney is not because of all the excuses he gives, but because her continued presence is a reminder of the fact that he is exemplifying cowardice and lies. And that her standing there on the podium reminds us all, reminds the nation what he stands for and what she stands for.
She's saying water is wet and the sky is blue, Jake. I mean, this is not controversial stuff. She's saying it's the most basic stuff.
Yeah, and also the thing is, when it comes to these lies, first of all, we've seen what they do, right? The January 6th insurrection was incited by months and months of spreading these lies. Beyond that is the fact that when it comes to lies like this, and the House Republican caucus and the leaders like McCarthy and Steve Scalise, they're like Doritos. You can't just do one. You keep lying and lying and lying. We saw last week McCarthy spreading the lie about Joe Biden wanting to steal your hamburgers for climate change. We've seen the appeasement of lies when it comes to COVID, and the fact that about half of Republican voters say that they're not willing to get vaccinated because of all the lies and fear that has been injected into the Republican bloodstream about health issues. We see the appeasement of the conspiracy theorists that support the deranged theory of QAnon, that there are satanic, cannibalistic pedophiles who run Hollywood and the Democratic Party. I mean, it just keeps going. That's the point. The lie about the election on its own is anti-democracy, and it is sowing seeds of ignorance in the populace, and obviously it has the potential to incite violence. But beyond that is, if you're willing to lie about that, what are you not willing to lie about? And, that's where we are when it comes to the House Republican leadership, McCarthy and Scalise, and where we are with too many leaders of the Republican Party. They're not willing to tell their voters the truth. What does that say about them?
And Jake, you've been really eloquent about this on your show, now 2 hours long every afternoon, I should know, that you're not saying that this isn't about Republican policy decisions. This isn't about small government or low taxes. That's what makes this so troubling. That's what draws into question so much.
Yeah, look, I happen to believe, my opinion and my politics and my knowledge of history, I happen to believe that this country needs a strong, thriving, healthy, fact-based Republican Party. I happen to believe that. I happen to believe that it's not good for one party to have all the control in Washington, whichever party it is, with no counter argument ever being made in a successful way. I don't think that's healthy. I don't think it's healthy for the country to only have a debate between the left and the far left. We need a thriving Republican Party. We need an argument, a counter argument. No, I think, this is not me, but we need a Republican.
I was mentioning this before, that he just goes through some counter arguments that I don't think have any merit. So he's yeah.
Party saying, no, I think that $6 trillion in new spending is a bad idea, and here's why. No, I think that subsidized daycare is the wrong way to go for our culture, and here's why. These are not, again, my arguments. These are arguments that conservatives would make. Okay, great. We need those debates happening, but we can't have those debates if one side of the argument is not willing to stick to standards and facts for a whole host of reasons. One of them is, how am I supposed to believe anything they say? If they're willing to lie about Joe Biden wanting to steal your hamburgers and QAnon and the big lie about the election, what are they not willing to lie about? Why should I put any of them on TV?
And Berman had this amazing interview with Michael Wood last hour, who lost in Texas running an anti-Trump platform. I mean, he was creamed. Yeah, he was creamed. And an incredible candidate, if you look at him on paper, right? And very well spoken and charismatic, but he lost so big. And you could just tell how discouraged he was because of the points that you're making there. But, you know, it's worth pointing out, Jake, that Republicans like Cheney and Mitt Romney, they never wavered in saying that Trump incited the insurrection on January 6th, unlike these Republicans. Let's watch.
So you think it was an impeachable offense?
Before Jordan. Oh, sure. If inciting to insurrection isn't, then I don't really know what is. Overall, I give the president an A.
The president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack on Congress by mob rioters. He should have immediately denounced the mob.
I was the first person to contact him when the riots was going on. He didn't see it. What he ended the call was telling me he'll put something out to make sure to stop this. And that's what he did.
I think the president bears responsibility for some of what happened. It was most certainly a foreseeable consequence of everything that was going on. President Trump is the most popular and most influential Republican in America. I think he'll still be that in 22 and in 24. And he decides to run for president and for the nomination, he's going to be the party's nominee. And that's the way I would view it.
All I can say is count me out. Enough is enough. I've tried to be helpful.
Donald Trump is the most vibrant member of the Republican Party. The Trump movement is alive and well.
President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day.
If the president was the party's nominee, would you support him?
The nominee of the party? Absolutely.
Nikki Haley is now coming out criticizing her former boss, telling Politico in an extensive new piece, quote, I don't think he's going to be in the picture. I don't think he can. He's fallen so far. We need to acknowledge he let us down. He went down the path he shouldn't have, and we shouldn't have followed him, and we shouldn't have listened to him, and we cannot let that happen again.
They beat him up before he got into office. They're beating him up after he leaves office. I mean, at some point, give the man a break. Move on.
I would not run if President Trump ran.
I think yesterday in particular, the president's language and rhetoric crossed a line and it was reckless. I disagree with it. And I have disagreed with the president's language and rhetoric for the last 4 years and have said so many, many times.
The partisan rage and the partisan anger the Democrats feel, they hate Donald J. Trump and they're engaging in an act that I think is petty. I think it is retribution. I think it is vindictive. And I think it's a waste of time. And so to coin a phrase, I think it's time to move on.
And they want him to go away. Let me tell you this right now. Donald J. Trump ain't going anywhere.
You know, lies are clearly good politics in the current GOP, but it makes you wonder as you look at.
Let's have a look. So yes, those people have shown an interesting trajectory in the shock after they themselves had to hide from murderous-minded insurrectionists, pro-Trump insurrectionists, Trump-incited insurrectionists who attacked the Capitol with the intention of holding legislators hostage, potentially killing some of them. I mean, they were seeking to hang Mike Pence for his perceived treachery towards Donald Trump. They knew that their lives were in jeopardy, that mobs are no longer rational. They're people whose inflamed sensibilities have led them to bring weapons and attack police officers, even whilst holding flags that proclaim their love and devotion of police officers. So Frank, you're going to get an earful from me for that comment. Frank says Biden seems to mean well, and he ran on his ability to bridge across the aisle, but he's shown very little of that talent at all, not laying fault, but he's kind of gone to the same executive order means for change. You wish things were more rational and based on logic and common sense. Now, here's where that's nonsensical, what you've just said, Frank, because Mitch McConnell has put his cards on the table today. You can hardly have missed it, that he's been very explicit in saying that his intention and his focus is 100% on obstructing the Biden administration. That's literally a direct quote from Mitch McConnell. Let's find it. He said the administration and not the Biden administration, but he did say it was 100% of his focus. Now, that means, yes, Biden and the Democrat Party in Congress that hold the executive branch and a majority in the Senate and the House have had to use budget reconciliation measures to pass legislation to help the American people out of the chaos and havoc created by Republican murderous levels of malfeasance and neglect. Biden has had to contend with obstructive behavior from Republicans, both in his capacity as a vice president for 8 years, when again, Mitch McConnell was clear in stating that he was most proud of his ability to have obstructed Obama's Supreme Court choice and that his intention was to block anything instigated by Obama and the Democrat Party. So none of this should be news to you, Frank, that you have a two-party political system where one party is not interested in upholding that logical, sensible debate around what might be best for the American people. One political party, the Republican Party, is very clear that it will seek to reduce by any means possible the capacity of the Democratic Party when in power to achieve anything because they are afflicted with an intractable case of oppositional defiance towards the Republican Party. That is what they run on for their base, amplifying and instigating tribalistic, vengeful approaches to politics rather than sensible policy approaches. They don't teach Republican voters to crave sensible social policy. They just teach them to be afraid of debt. They teach them to be afraid of wokeness, which can be irritating when manifested by some emotionally indulgent white people, I grant you, but as often articulated by Black Americans, wokeness is just a way of describing the talks that they have to their children to alert them to the fact that there's a lot of people who won't treat them fairly, a lot of people in positions of power and authority. So wokeness is really that, being aware that if you don't have hyper compliance with police officers, your life might be in danger. And so extrapolating from that, wokeness in the American public is an understanding that racism didn't end when slavery was abolished. Racism didn't end when Civil Rights Act was introduced. Racism didn't end when Obama became president. And the consequences of racist activity did not end then either. And the impact and the legacy of racist systems did not end. So systematic racism means racism that's become so habitual, it doesn't even require an individual to uphold it, defend it, or justify it. It's just become the status quo. It is what it is. It is what it is bank loans are less likely to be given to Black individuals seeking to start a business. They're more likely to have to borrow from a smaller bank. One of the ways in which the Trump administration was able to ensure that relief funds were disproportionately withheld from Black business owners, because those loans were, by the workings of the Trump administration, delivered through bigger banks, which are, at a probabilistic level, less likely to ever lend to small Black business owners. So no, there is no room at all on this broadcast for me to indulge the sentiment that Biden is somehow at fault for the entrenched obstructionism of the Republican Party. And indeed, I'm here to help people get woke to what Republicans are doing, because without that awareness, you can't effectively hold Republicans accountable for the way in which they have sabotaged the well-being and the prosperity of millions of Americans in service to the financial advantage of their donors, such as Charles Koch, Robert Mercer, Rupert Murdoch, people who exert powerful influence, either directly control media outlets or influence university institutions, who influence who groom experts who then get to appear on Fox and help indoctrinate the populace about the government economy, so the government budget being necessary to run the government budget as if it were a household budget, and that all debt is necessarily bad. An opinion which I'll have to say Republicans absolutely go quiet on when in power, and they run up trillions in public debt, creating avenues for their donors to, and the wealthy class that they are loyal to, the uber wealthy class that they are loyal to, instinctively loyal to avoid paying taxes. And when I say instinctively, I should say it's not really a matter of instinct, is it? The wealthiest people in America get a very good return on their investment of donating to Republicans. And of course, conservative Supreme Court justices have facilitated that with their Citizens United decision that enables corporations to have First Amendment protection rights, the right of protected speech, and that protected speech being applicable to money and financial donations, so that they are free to make huge millions of dollars worth of financial donations through corporations to super PACs to complement the operations of the various Republican candidates they support. Nazim is also one of these, both sides are bad, both sides are at fault for Republican obstruction people. Thanks for joining in, Nazim, but you've bought into some bullshit. Let me be clear with you. I try not to be authoritative about this because I know it's very much an American characteristic to value the respecting of other people's opinions. But you know what? I have days where I say, to heck with that. To heck with that. It's a disinformation that has been pushed on the American people because it serves conservative interests very well. And for people to say both parties, for people to be dismissive of both parties is unfair. It is unfair and is ignorant of the milieu in which Democrats operate, a milieu in which conservative narratives hold sway over people's imaginations to a large degree because they're very successfully propagated and disseminated by powerful media machines, media disinformation machines. Fox News has a lot of the most popular shows on television. So when you say this, that you hope people will get fed up with both parties and look at an independent young candidate in a serious manner, as if youth is inherently virtuous. It's not. Neither is old age. People can get rusted on to malevolence with their old age. People can have years of honed experience as a public servant that help them deliver for the public, much as Joe Biden is doing now. Yeah, you've always voted Democrat, but you would love a new option to sabotage the Democratic Party, just as independent voters did in 2016. So I would praise you for your insights, except I think the opposite is true. Knowledge has enjoyed my rantingness. Sheldon brings up a very important point that today, former Attorney General, corrupt William Barr, was criticized by well-respected Judge Amy Berman Jackson, who noted, and it's quite complicated, that when the Mueller report was released and William Barr came out that same weekend with a letter saying, I've processed all of this and it's clear from the report, I've been advised that there's no possible case to prosecute President Trump. He's been exonerated for obstruction and he's been exonerated for collusion. So he was very adamant that Donald Trump was cleared. Now, there were a lot of us who'd been following the Mueller report very intently, following what had become public about various details indicating, various data points indicating collusion between Trump's campaign managers, Trump's defense appointees, the senior defense advisor, Michael Flynn, and his contacts with Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador at the time. We knew there was something going on, and we didn't really believe William Barr. But the mainstream media took William Barr's pronouncements as authoritative, and so did the rest of the public. Anybody who hadn't been following along closely, which was a very small subset of not only the American population, but also the international population who were following this like as if it were the most compelling story of our time, which it was, but not to everyone. We were helpless in the face of this wall of deceit from William Barr. So Judge Amy Berman Jackson has taken an important step to unpack some of that travesty. She said that when William Barr said he was advised by people, she has had access to the emails exchanged amongst those people, and she published a table with the chronology and sequence of those emails to make it evident that when they said there were people making the advice and then they delivered it to William Barr, that actually the people receiving the advice were colluding and cooperating with the people devising and writing the advice. So that it's obvious that William Barr had pre-concluded that there was going to be no condition under which Trump had to face prosecution for the enumerated instances of collusion detailed in the Mueller report. There was no way that they were going to do that. So it was a big cover-up that multiple people in the Department of Justice were involved in. I'll bring up an article so we can at least learn some of their names and increase. But a name that's been trending a little bit this morning is Rod Rosenstein, because he was the Deputy Attorney General and his signature is on some of those memos. And it's evident that he was playing a big role in the protection racket that was operating in the Department of Justice. And the Office of Legal Counsel, which is separate. The Office of Legal Counsel is the organization that wrote a memo in 1973, so different people then, but they wrote a memo to say presidents shouldn't be prosecuted, i.e. that's too destabilizing for the US, so let's not do it. That was just a memo, it wasn't legislation, but that was taken as advisory by Bill Barr, who was also very motivated not to destabilize America by prosecuting a corrupt president who was illegitimately holding office, having colluded with Russia and then tried to cover up and obstructed Robert Mueller's ability to hold him accountable for those crimes. And obstruction is a crime, it's a process crime indicating likely guilt in relation to other crimes. You obstruct because you don't want to be held accountable for your actions. So here is I'll bring up this piece by Marcy Wheeler, who writes under the pseudonym Empty Wheel. And she thinks it's hopeful that Judge Amy Berman Jackson's decision to compel this memo to be released, that it will shed light on the Office of Legal Counsel and how their memos have often indicated cooperation between people who are supposed to be, there's supposed to be a wall. There's supposed to be separation between people who come up with legal advice and people who accept this legal advice and say, okay, you've independently come up with that, I'll accept it. There's been a lot of working together in a protection racket, and she's hoping that it gets exposed to a degree by what's happening now. Okay. So yesterday, Judge Amy Berman Jackson ruled that the government must turn over a memo written, ostensibly by Office of Legal Counsel head Steve Engel, to justify Billy Barr's decision not to file charges against Donald Trump for obstructing the Mueller investigation. The Center for Responsibility and Ethics, CRE, in Washington, Freedom of Information the memo and sued for its release. The memo itself is worth reading. A key part of ABJ's decision pivoted on the claims made by Paul Colburn, who's the lawyer from OLC, whose job it is, in part, to tell courts that the Department of Justice can't release pre-decisional OLC memos because that would breach both deliberative and attorney-client processes. And then there's Vanessa Brinkman, whose job it is, in part, to tell courts that DOJ has appropriately applied one or other of the exemptions permitted under FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. And senior trial attorney Julie Strauss-Harris, who was stuck arguing against the release of this document by relying on those declarations. ABJ ruled that all three had made misrepresentations, and in the case of Strauss-Harris, outright invention, to falsely claim that the memo was pre-decisional and therefore appropriate to withhold under FOIA's B5 exemption. This is more legal stuff than I ever really want to engage with, but the point of what I'm saying is pre-decisional memorandums apparently have a B5 exemption from freedom of information, but Amy Berman Jackson read the emails and said, it's not pre-decisional. They got the Mueller report and said, yeah, there's no way in hell we're ever prosecuting Trump for anything. What can we say? What can we say to tell the public that we have this legal rule that predates the Mueller report to say, no, you can't prosecute a president. So Nazim says, interesting stream, thanks for the insight. You're welcome, Nazim. Phil is saying to Frank that the Republicans are the disingenuous ones. You can't negotiate or cooperate with them. Their past actions prove it. And even if you don't want to keep holding people accountable for their past actions, their present, literally today, actions of saying out loud that their 100% of their focus is on obstructing the administration. Bernadette says collusion isn't a crime, unfortunately. There's been a lot of semantic debate about that, hasn't there? But there's lots of crimes involved in inappropriately liaising with a foreign adversarial country prior to an election. It violates all manner of campaign finance laws because campaign finance laws are to say Americans can donate to your campaigns and Americans can work on your campaigns. So if you have a secret parallel campaign being run by Russians that you collaborate with, that's not a legally acceptable super PAC. Phil at least is wondering now what Barr buried in the Iran-Contra affair. One assumes a lot, and it just hasn't come up as a topic. Frank, I think you might have misunderstood. So when you say Biden ran on unity, he didn't run on unity with Republican politicians. He ran on unity with Republican voters. So he said, I will represent everyone. If I'm president, he drew a contrast and a distinction between himself and Donald Trump, that he wouldn't be the kind of person saying, well, that state doesn't deserve disaster relief, and hint that it's, because they annoy him, which then becomes evident that he won't help them because they're a state that votes for Democratic candidates predominantly. So remember when California had wildfires and Trump didn't want to deliver federal aid to California? That's what Biden indicated he would not do, that he was going to be somebody who united the country and didn't say, oh, Black Lives Matter protesters, those sons of bitches. He was going to be someone who said, yep, that's legitimate. There are problems. There's inequality in protection under the law. There's some communities that are being harmed and oppressed by the status quo. Whereas Trump said it's unpatriotic to question the status quo. And he asked for police officers to bump people's heads if they were getting into cars. He said, don't be so careful with them. He increased conflict in America, even though Republicans, I know, like to say Obama increased conflict by acknowledging that there are racial inequalities. So Republicans like to claim that drawing attention to the truth is divisive. But that's not true, because ignoring inequality perpetuates division. It's just that it ensures that the burden of that silence is borne by the people who are oppressed. And Biden's honesty ensures that some of the burden of the honesty, because honesty is also a burden to try and process it and incorporate it, the burden of that is discomfort that has to then be borne by people who've been previously ignorant. So yes, the people who claim, this discomfort is uncomfortable, I'm afraid that my people will lose their motivation and their mojo if our attention is drawn to oppression of Black people and how that hasn't just finished. It's not in the distant past. It's ongoing. It's present. It accounts for a lot of wealth disparity in our communities, which then accounts for a lot of criminal system disparity as well. Because yes, people who are impoverished and excluded from certain opportunities in life by virtue of being trapped in cycles of poverty, to acknowledge that is not to deny the American dream. It's just to acknowledge the reality of how certain communities are underserved by government services. They've had highways built over the top of them. They've had higher exposure to lead paint and lead from exhaust fumes before lead was eradicated from petrol. And so you need 20 years after lead is eradicated to reduce the amount of developmental disabilities you have that leads to a probabilistic increase in criminal tendencies being developed by people who have been unable to perform satisfactorily within the educational system, and whose lack of compliance in school may have led them to be introduced to a school to prison pipeline. And that's a factor you can acknowledge, even alongside acknowledging the role of personal conscience and personal responsibility. Nazim says to each his own, that's what democracy is all about. No. And of course it is. It is, but there are different perspectives we can take on how polite or tolerant we have to be to each other when we disagree. And some politeness and some devotion to civility comes at the expense of Black Americans. And I hesitate to appoint myself a spokesperson, but I will, in that at least I'm willing to sit with that discomfort of being white and saying there's a degree of white culpability here in a historical and ongoing sense. There's a degree of white passivity in the face of injustice. And I'm happy to work with that discomfort, and I'm happy to learn some more, and I'm happy to call people out, and I'm happy to breach those rules of civility. And I'm happy to be falsely accused of undermining democracy by not being indulgent or passive when people float damaging and harmful theories. And I'm not just being a woke, self-indulgent virtue signaler here. I'm saying that devotion to overgeneralizing about the problems with government, of saying, oh, it's both sides, oh, it's just Congress in a broad sense that's problematic, that is a very pervasive and damaging attitude, and that attitude helps Republicans maintain their stranglehold on American society. That helps Republicans sustain a murderous impact on Americans, whereby they have control of various state legislatures. They murderously fail to lock down when there are pandemics. They murderously precipitately end mask mandates or social distancing mandates. They murderously encourage church gatherings and houses of worship gatherings, which cause death during a pandemic when there is a virus that is spread by airborne mechanisms, particularly in close contact, low ventilation rooms with crowds inside. So yes, it's very significant, and it's something I'm quite prepared to stand my ground on. And I think that's a strength, and that conviction gives me the courage to deal with people saying, but surely I have the right to my opinion. Sure. And I have the right to denounce your opinion. So there you go. I'm not content to just contrast my opinion to yours. I'm actively going to point out to you if I think your opinion is facilitating the actions and inaction of murderers. And I'm happy to go to that extreme, because before COVID, I would just say, I think this is going to result in mass murder. And I drew on my familial history to say my great-grandparents were murdered in the death camp at Belzec because of people being passive as fascism escalated, as the hateful rhetoric and xenophobia of fascism took hold in German politics. And not all Germans were on board with that, but not enough Germans stood up and organized against it when it was smaller. And it escalated until windows were being smashed, laws were being made to prevent Jewish people from owning businesses. Hatred was cultivated and amplified and weaponized as a political support group that helped leaders like Hitler, who didn't really make Germany more efficient. He's been described as a disorganized, self-indulgent person who woke up at 11 and spent hours reading the newspapers about himself, because he governed through emotional manipulation, through appeals to patriotism, false appeals to patriotism, and false appeals to the innate superiority of the German people. So the opposite side, or the counter side to appeals to the innate superiority of a race, like the Aryan race, is also people who get addicted to negatively overgeneralizing about politics and saying, oh, both parties, see, don't worry, I'm not like the Germans falling in love with Hitler, and I'm not like Trumpets falling in love with Trump. I hate everybody. That is a precondition that helps Trump come to power. That is a precondition that helps the general malaise that allows or acts as fertile soil for a Trump or a Hitler to flourish. So snap out of it. Get more specific. Learn about who specifically is obstructing good policies. Learn more about who specifically is harming your local community, who's promoting unequal protection under the law for minorities in your community. It's, typically speaking, bills of rights for police officers drawn up by police unions in your state and in your counties. There's lots of things you can learn about, lots of ways you can advance your understanding, and me too. But I have no time and no patience for people who want to rest on their laurels of being just generally negative about everything. And they think that's enough to qualify them as a responsible and concerned citizen. And my argument is it's not enough. And I will speak out very, very vociferously against that point of view. Craig is going to bed. Good night, Craig. Sorry, I missed that 6 words ago. Sheldon says buzzwords for Trump. This includes socialism, which does resonate with Republicans. And look, that makes me think that one way to achieve more bipartisan consensus amongst voters is to show a history with the history, to show a familiarity with the history of communism and its iterations in different countries around the world, and to show that you understand where the excesses of justice thinking and equality thinking can lead. Because it's true that some younger people and some idealistic older people like Bernie, or notionally idealistic people like Bernie, I don't think he's truly idealistic. He's kind of idealistic in a very white-centric way, and often denies the virtue of Black American arguments that they need to be better served by politics by saying, oh, identity politics just alienates the white working class and they're really important. Well, Bernie, the Black working class is also part of the working class. And when you help Black Americans get justice, it tends to advance the interests of justice for Americans generally. So, yeah, I have a lot of things to say about Bernie, many of which are not positive, but that can be for another day. People want to thank him for advancing public embrace of progressive worldviews, progressive ways of understanding how corporations work and at whose expense they flourish sometimes. But I think acknowledging Bernie's legacy is often to deny Hillary Clinton's longer and more productive legacy, which has a strong degree of overlap. She wanted to expand Medicare in the 1990s, and Bernard adopted that, and Liz adopted that. But yeah, Hillary Clinton initiated that movement. No throwing in the towel. I mean, do as you want, but I won't indulge it. Phil's point is to sit back, watch the Republicans be divided amongst themselves and hope that the Democrats can save democracy. It's interesting, Republicans are divided amongst themselves, but Republican-oriented media is not very divided, which means over time they're strengthening the majority of subset of deluded Republicans who think that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. So it would be great to have some more division in Republican supportive media. Republican colleague, in the parts of the media that are effective, unelected colleagues of the Republicans. Kim gave me a listen up award. Phil's going to bed. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Phil, Sheldon, Kim. Thank you so much for the award, Kim. That's lovely. Very kind of you. Craig might have already gone. Frank may or may not still be here after I yelled at him. Nazim said thanks for the insight, which I appreciate. Nazim. Sheldon suggested that Barr should be investigated and prosecuted. Absolutely. I think we're all done. Sheldon says, as our agencies recover from the previous misadministration, our democracy becomes stronger. Fingers crossed. And certainly America's benefiting big time from the Biden administration's very efficient approach to improving things. But at the same time, there needs to be a path for them to go forwards. And I don't know how that's going to change, whether Joe Manchin will find it in his heart to change, or Kristen Sinema, that they'll stop obstructing a Democratic move to end the filibuster, because with that filibuster, they can't pass the S1 Act, which is the For the People Act, which acts to shore up and secure democratic safeguards to prevent Republican-controlled state legislatures from sabotaging democracy and making it harder for Black communities to vote, for making up voter ID provisions that they know will jeopardize the access of older Black Americans to vote, or non-car owning Americans to vote, or just Americans with less money. Because if you're an older Black American and you're born during segregation and you were therefore excluded or your mother was excluded from a hospital setting when giving birth, so you don't have a hospital issued birth certificate and it'll cost you a heap of money to get one, it's knowingly and willfully done by Republicans to request certain forms of ID. Kim asks for people to share the wit and wisdom of Davkat far and wide, please. Absolutely. If you've enjoyed the broadcast and if you've thought of this broadcast as contributing to the collected total of wit and wisdom in the world, then feel free to click on something that will help you share it. Is there any button in HAPS that lets you just share the broadcast? Because I feel like that was maybe easier with Periscope, but I don't know. Anyway, take care, everybody. All the best. See you tomorrow. And yes, Biden's created, I think, 1 million private sector jobs, or is it more? A lot. Ronald Klein put out a notification about it. Oh, it's Mother's Day soon. We'll talk more about Mother's Day tomorrow. Take care, everybody. And I'll do another broadcast with Lydia when her daughter's vaccinated, which she will be soon as there's enough supply. And we might get to interview her 13-year-old daughter about what it's like for her, specifically post-vaccine as well. Sheldon said he loved the broadcast. Happy Mother's Day. Thanks, Sheldon. Take care, everybody. All the best. And for my Patreon sponsors, thank you so much. And guess what I did? I worked out how to do a YouTube video that is only accessible by my Patreons. I can't see who they are right now. Oh, I can look at my messages. Alan, Bernadette, Sheldon, John, Aaron, Phil, Clark, Mark, Drew, Christopher, Bob and Holly, Clayton, Elizabeth, Deidre, Alexandra, Zinte. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. There's a song flick for a few seconds, and that means I've worked out how to do it. I'll do it some more. I might do the singing part just for Patreons, and that way I won't feel like I'm muddying the waters of my political broadcasts with my singing. But you can access the singing if you go to the Patreon website and look me up. There should be an attached video. Cheers. Thank you, Knowledge. Bye, everybody.